Ambassador Zilketh had spent 3 long years studying the species called humans before he ever saw one in person, and nothing in his research had prepared him for the reality of standing in the same room with them. He remembered the day clearly, the way his 4 hearts had beaten too fast when the airlock doors opened, and the human delegation walked into the Galactic Council's greeting chamber aboard Station Nexus Prime. There were 5 of them, led by a woman named Katie Morgan, who served as Earth's official envoy to the galaxy. And beside her walked a tall, broad-shouldered man named Jake Lawson, who carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who had never known true fear. Zilketh watched them approach with a mixture of scientific curiosity and deep primal terror that he could not quite suppress, no matter how hard he tried. The humans smiled at everyone they passed, showing their teeth in what Zilketh knew was meant to be a friendly gesture, even if it felt anything but. Though every instinct in his body screamed that bared teeth meant danger and death. Katie extended her hand toward him, and he forced himself to reach out with his own slender appendage, feeling her warm fingers close around his with a gentleness that seemed almost rehearsed. "Ambassador Zilketh," she said in a voice that was surprisingly soft, "we are so honored to finally meet you in person after all our communications." He managed to reply with the appropriate diplomatic phrases, but his mind was elsewhere, focused entirely on the sensation of her grip and the knowledge that she could have crushed every bone in his hand without even trying. The Valorian people had evolved on a world with gravity barely 1/3 of Earth's standard, in an environment so calm and temperate that they had never needed to develop strength or aggression or any of the countless survival mechanisms that humans took for granted. Zilketh had read the reports about Earth, planet the Council scientists had classified as a Category 7 death world, and he had memorized every terrifying detail. Earth was a planet of extremes, where temperatures could swing from freezing cold to burning heat within a single day, where the ground shook without warning and mountains spewed fire into the sky, where massive storms tore across the surface and the very air could become poisonous if the wind blew the wrong way. The oceans were filled with predators that could swallow a Valorian whole, and the land was crawling with creatures that had evolved specifically to kill and consume other living things. And yet the humans had not merely survived on this nightmare world. They had thrived and multiplied and spread across every corner of it, adapting to deserts and jungles and frozen wastelands as if such environments were perfectly normal places to live. Zilketh had wondered for years how any species could emerge from such a world without becoming monsters, and now he was beginning to understand. The humans were monsters, but they did not know it. Jake Lawson wandered over to a refreshment table where several Threlian diplomats were gathered, and Zilketh watched him reach out to shake hands with the Threlian ambassador, whose name was Counselor Veth. Jake barely squeezed at all, Zilketh could tell, but Counselor Veth still flinched and pulled his hand back with a soft hiss of discomfort. "Oh gosh, I am so sorry," Jake said immediately, his face flushing with what appeared to be genuine embarrassment. "I keep forgetting how careful I need to be. Please forgive me." Counselor Veth assured him that no harm was done, though Zilketh noticed him flexing his fingers repeatedly for the next several minutes, as if checking to make sure nothing was broken. Katie appeared at Zilketh's side and sighed quietly as she watched her colleague apologize profusely to everyone nearby. "Practicing," she said in a tone of mild frustration. "But it is harder than you might think to remember that we are different from everyone else here." Zilketh tilted his head in the Valorian gesture of curiosity and asked her what she meant by that. "Well," Katie said thoughtfully, "where we come from, everyone is like us, so we never had to think about being careful with our strength or speed or any of that. It was just normal." She paused and looked around the chamber, at the dozens of alien species mingling and conversing, and something like wonder crossed her face. "This is the first time we have ever met anyone who is not like us," she admitted, "and we are still learning what that means." Zylketh found this statement profoundly disturbing in ways he could not quite articulate. The idea that humans genuinely believed themselves to be ordinary, that they had no frame of reference for their own extraordinary capabilities because they had never encountered anything else. He excused himself and moved to the far side of the chamber, where he could observe without being noticed. And he watched the humans mingle with growing fascination and dread. Jake leaned casually against a decorative pillar while chatting with a group of Mendari traders, and Zylketh heard a sharp cracking sound that made several nearby aliens jump in alarm. The pillar, which was made of reinforced crystalline alloy, designed to withstand micrometeorite impacts during space travel, now had a visible fracture running up its length from where Jake's shoulder had been resting against it. Jake glanced at the crack with mild curiosity, shrugged, and moved away to lean against the wall instead, apparently deciding that the pillar was somehow defective. He never mentioned it to anyone, and seemed to forget about it entirely within minutes. Zylketh stared at the damaged pillar for a long time, his four hearts racing as he tried to process what he had just witnessed. A human had cracked a material strong enough to survive impacts that would destroy most spacecraft, simply by leaning on it. And he had not even noticed. He had assumed the pillar was the problem, not himself. Later that evening, after the reception had ended, and the human delegation had retired to their quarters, Zylketh sat alone in his office and began composing his first official report on humanity. He wrote about their physical capabilities, their casual strength, their apparent obliviousness to their own power, and he struggled to find words that would convey the sheer strangeness of what he had observed. "These beings could crush us without effort," he wrote. "They could tear through our strongest materials with their bare hands. They could survive conditions that would kill any of us within minutes. And yet they smile, and apologize, and worry about offending us with their handshakes." He paused and considered his next words carefully, knowing that this report would be read by every member of the Galactic Council, and would shape their understanding of humanity for generations to come. End of P. "The most dangerous thing about humans," he finally wrote, "is not their strength, or their speed, or their resilience. The most dangerous thing is that they do not know they possess these qualities. They think they are ordinary. They think their world is normal. They think everyone can do what they can do. They have no idea how terrifying they truly are, and somehow that makes them more terrifying still." He saved the report and sent it to the council archives, then sat back in his chair and wondered what the future would hold now that humanity had joined the galactic community. He suspected it would be interesting. He also suspected it would be absolutely terrifying. And he was quite certain that the humans themselves would have no idea why. 6 months had passed since humanity's first official contact with the Galactic Council, and humans had begun spreading across the stars with an enthusiasm that surprised no one who knew anything about their history. They were explorers by nature, driven by an insatiable curiosity that had pushed them to cross oceans and climb mountains, and eventually leave their own planet behind. Now, they brought that same restless energy to the galaxy at large. Danny Cole was 26 years old and had always dreamed of working among the stars, so when the opportunity came to serve as an engineer on Kepler station, he had jumped at it without hesitation. Kepler was a mining outpost on the edge of Valorian space, a massive structure that floated in orbit around a mineral-rich asteroid belt and employed workers from a dozen different species. Danny loved it there, loved the constant hum of machinery and the challenge of keeping ancient equipment running, and the strange, wonderful diversity of his co-workers. His best friend on the station was a Valorian named Pilteth, who worked in the medical bay, and together they spent their off hours exploring the station's recreation areas and sampling cuisine from across the galaxy. Amy Santos was the station's human medic, a calm, competent woman in her early 30s who had served as a combat medic on Earth before deciding she wanted to help people in peacetime instead. She and Danny had become friends almost immediately, drawn together by their shared humanity in a place where humans were still a novelty. The day everything changed started like any other day, with Danny crawling through maintenance tunnels to repair a malfunctioning air recycler on the station's lower levels. He was elbow-deep in wiring when the lights flickered and died, and a moment later, the familiar pull of artificial gravity simply vanished. Danny floated up from his work and grabbed a support beam to steady himself, immediately recognizing the signs of a gravity generator failure. For him, it was merely inconvenient, a minor annoyance that would make his job a little harder until the backup systems kicked in. He did not realize until later that for everyone else on the station, it was a potential death sentence. The Valorians and most other species on Kepler had evolved in gravity fields far weaker than Earth's, and their bodies depended on the station's carefully calibrated artificial gravity to function properly. Without it, they became disoriented and weak, their muscles unable to cope with even the slightest exertion, their hearts struggling to pump blood through their bodies. Danny made his way to the main engineering bay and found chaos. Alien workers floating helplessly and crying out in languages he did not understand, their bodies limp and their eyes wide with fear. He grabbed them one by one and guided them to handholds along the walls, the zero gravity with an ease that seemed impossible to them. Amy's voice crackled over the comm system, calm and steady despite the circumstances, directing people to emergency stations and coordinating rescue efforts across the station. Danny reached her within minutes and found her already treating a group of Threllians who had collapsed when the gravity failed, their respiratory systems unable to function properly without the constant downward pull they were accustomed to. "Mining Sector 7 is in trouble," Amy told him without looking up from her patient. "There was a collapse when the gravity went out, and people are trapped. I need you to get down there." Danny did not hesitate, pushing off from the wall and flying through the corridors toward the mining sector with a speed that would have been impossible for anyone else on the station. He arrived to find a scene of devastation, heavy equipment floating in the darkness, and Valorian miners crying out from somewhere beneath a pile of collapsed support beams. The rescue team was still 20 minutes away, delayed by the chaos spreading throughout the station, and the trapped miners did not have 20 minutes to spare. Danny assessed the situation with the quick, practical eye of an engineer, and realized that the main obstacle was a massive support beam that had fallen across the tunnel entrance, pinning at least 4 miners beneath it. The beam weighed approximately 300 kilograms, far too heavy for the Valorians to lift even under normal gravity conditions, and in their weakened state, they could barely move at all. Danny grabbed the beam with both hands and pulled, feeling his muscles strain as he fought against the inertia of the massive object. It moved, slowly at first, then faster as he found the right leverage point and threw his full weight into the effort. And suddenly the beam was rising, and the trapped miners were scrambling free, help from their co-workers. Danny held the beam for nearly 4 minutes, his arms trembling and sweat dripping from his face, until the last miner was clear and he could finally let go. He collapsed against the tunnel wall and gasped for breath, his heart pounding and his muscles screaming in protest, and he wondered vaguely why everyone was staring at him like he had just performed some kind of miracle. Amy arrived with her medical kit and began treating the injured miners, checking for broken bones and internal bleeding, and all the other injuries that could result from being crushed beneath 300 kilograms of metal. One of the miners, an elderly Valorian named Kethvar, grabbed Danny's arm with trembling fingers, and spoke in a voice thick with emotion. "You saved us," he said. "You lifted that beam like it was nothing. How is such a thing possible?" Danny blinked at him in confusion and shrugged his aching shoulders. "Adrenaline," he said. "You know how it is. When people are in danger, you just do what you have to do. Anyone would have done the same thing." Kethvar stared at him for a long moment, then turned to look at the other miners who had gathered around them. "He does not understand," Kethvar said softly, and something like awe crept into his voice. "He truly does not understand what he has done." The rescue team arrived shortly afterward and took over the evacuation, and Danny found himself being guided to the medical bay by Amy, who insisted on checking him for injuries. "You held that beam for almost 4 minutes," she said, as she scanned his arms for muscle damage. "That was incredible." Danny laughed tiredly and shook his head. "It was not that heavy," he said. "I mean, it was heavy, but not like impossibly heavy, you know?" Amy paused and gave him a strange look that he could not quite interpret. "Danny," she said slowly, "that beam weighed 300 kilograms. No other species on this station could have lifted it at all, let alone held it for 4 minutes." Danny considered this information and then shrugged again. "Well," he said, "I guess I got lucky." The miners started calling him the Iron Giant after that day, a nickname that spread throughout the station and eventually across the entire sector. Danny found this deeply embarrassing and asked everyone repeatedly to just call him by his name. But the nickname stuck anyway. He never did understand why everyone made such a big deal out of what he had done. After all, he had just helped some people who were in trouble. Anyone would have done the same thing. That was what he truly believed, and no amount of evidence to the contrary could convince him otherwise. He was just an ordinary guy who had been in the right place at the right time. The fact that no one else in the galaxy could have done what he did never occurred to him. And that, more than anything else, was what made the aliens around him stare in wonder and whisper among themselves about the strange, impossible creatures called humans. The Kreth Dominion had ruled the outer systems for nearly 500 years, conquering world after world with brutal efficiency and enslaving any species unfortunate enough to stand in their way. They were massive creatures, standing nearly 3 meters tall, with thick armored hides and claws that could tear through steel, and they had never encountered a species capable of resisting their might. When they learned that a small soft species called humans had begun spreading across the galaxy, they saw nothing but easy prey. The colony on New Haven was barely 2 years old when the Kreth warfleet appeared in orbit. A dozen massive warships carrying 10,000 soldiers who expected to find frightened colonists ready to surrender. Instead, they found Chris Bradley. Chris was 43 years old and had spent 20 years in Earth's military before retiring to help build a new life on New Haven. And when the Kreth ships appeared on the colony's sensors, felt something click into place inside his mind. He had hoped he would never have to fight again, but he had always known deep down that peace was temporary, and that someday the skills he had worked so hard to develop would be needed once more. The colonial militia numbered only 800 people, farmers and engineers and teachers who had trained for emergencies but never expected to face a full-scale invasion. Chris gathered them in the colony's main hall and looked out at their frightened faces and felt a strange calm settle over him. "I am not going to lie to you," he said in a voice that carried to every corner of the room. "We are outnumbered and outgunned, and the odds are not in our favor." He paused and let those words sink in before continuing. "But we are human," he said, "and that means something, even if we do not always remember what." His second in command was a woman named Megan Torres, who had served with him years ago and had followed him to New Haven when she heard he was building something new. She stood beside him now, with the same steady determination that had carried her through a dozen campaigns on Earth. and when she spoke, her voice was calm and certain. "We have been preparing for this," she said. "We have fortified positions, and supply caches, and defensive systems that will make them pay for every meter of ground they take." The Kreth landed their forces the next morning, expecting to sweep through the colony in a matter of hours. They did not know that humans could function on minimal sleep for days at a time, their bodies producing chemicals that kept them alert and focused long after other species would have collapsed from exhaustion. They did not know that humans could regulate their body temperature and fight in environments ranging from freezing cold to burning heat, conditions that would have incapacitated the Kreth soldiers within minutes. That humans healed from injuries at a rate that seemed almost supernatural. Wounds that should have been fatal, becoming mere inconveniences within days. And they certainly did not know about Ben Harris. Ben was 22 years old, and had joined the militia mostly because his friends had joined, never expecting to actually fight in a real war. On the third day of the siege, he found himself separated from his squad, and surrounded by Kreth soldiers, his weapon empty and his back against a wall. The Kreth commander approached him slowly, savoring the moment, confident that this small soft creature posed no threat whatsoever. Ben did not think about what he did next. His body simply reacted with instincts buried deep in human DNA from millions of years of evolution on a world that wanted to kill them. He bit the Kreth commander. His teeth, which had evolved to tear through the tough meat of Earth's prey animals, crunched through the Kreth's supposedly impenetrable armor plating and sank into the flesh beneath. The commander screamed and stumbled backward, and in that moment of confusion, Ben grabbed a fallen weapon and fought his way back to friendly lines. He was very apologetic about the whole thing afterward, repeatedly telling anyone who would listen that he had not meant to bite anyone, and that it had just sort of happened. His squad mates found this hilarious, and started calling him Chomper, a nickname he accepted with resigned embarrassment. The siege lasted 11 days. 11 days of constant fighting, of humans pushing themselves beyond limits that other species did not know existed, of wounds that should have been fatal, and exhaustion that should have been crippling, and fear that should have been paralyzing. On the 12th day, the Kreth retreated. Their losses were staggering. Nearly 60% of their invasion force killed or wounded by a defending force less than 1/10 their size. And for the first time in 500 years, the mighty Kreth Dominion had been defeated. The Galactic Council sent observers to document the aftermath, and they found a colony that was battered but unbroken. Humans already beginning to rebuild what had been destroyed. Chris Bradley met with the council representatives and answered their questions with the same calm patience he had shown throughout the siege. "How did you do it?" they asked him. "How did 800 colonists defeat 10,000 Kreth warriors?" Chris seemed uncomfortable with the question, and shifted his weight from one foot to the other, before answering. "We got lucky," he said. "The Kreth underestimated us, and we were able to use that to our advantage." He paused and looked out at the colonists working to repair their homes and their lives. "The real heroes are the civilians," he said. "The people who kept the power running and the water flowing and the food growing while we were fighting. Without them, we would have lost on the first day." Megan stood beside him and said nothing, but her eyes told a different story. She knew what they had done, knew the impossible odds they had overcome, knew that no other species in the galaxy could have held that line for 11 days against an enemy that outnumbered them more than 10 to 1. But Chris did not see it that way. He saw only the things that had gone wrong, the people they had lost, the moments when victory had seemed impossible. He could not accept that what they had done was extraordinary, because to him it was simply what needed to be done. Ambassador Zilketh received a full report on the Battle of New Haven, and added it to his growing file on humanity with trembling hands. "They do not recognize their own martial prowess," he wrote. "They attribute their victories to luck and circumstance and the efforts of others. They fought an enemy that had conquered a 100 worlds, and they won. And they act as if this is nothing special. He paused and considered his next words carefully. I am beginning to understand, he wrote, why the Kreth retreated. It was not because they had lost too many soldiers, though their losses were indeed catastrophic. It was because they realized something that the humans themselves have never grasped. You cannot defeat an enemy that does not know it should be defeated. You cannot break a spirit that does not understand it should be broken. The humans won because they never considered the possibility that they might lose. And that, more than any weapon or strategy or fortification, is what makes them the most dangerous species in the galaxy. The medical frigate Mercy's Hope was 3 days out from the nearest starbase when they received the distress call, a desperate plea for help from a Valorian transport ship called the Wandering Star. Dr. Nathan Perry was reviewing patient files in his office when the alert came through, and he immediately made his way to the bridge to assess the situation. The Wandering Star was carrying nearly 200 passengers and crew, and according to their distress call, they were dealing with an outbreak of Kellian fever. Nathan knew about Kellian fever from his medical training, knew that it was relatively harmless to humans, but absolutely devastating to most other species in the galaxy. Without treatment, the mortality rate was nearly 90%, and even with treatment, many patients never fully recovered. How long until we can reach them? He asked the captain, a grizzled human named Sam Webb, who had been running medical missions for nearly 30 years. 6 hours, Sam replied. Maybe 5 if we push the engines. Nathan nodded and began preparing his medical team for what was coming, knowing that they would need every resource they had to save the people on that ship. His assistant was a nurse named Laura Kim, who had worked beside him for 3 years, and she was already organizing supplies and briefing the other medics by the time he reached the medical bay. The human medical staff numbered only 12 people, with an additional 8 alien medics who specialized in treating their own species. It should have been enough. It was not. The Wandering Star was worse than anyone had expected, the disease having spread far faster than normal due to the ship's malfunctioning air filtration system. By the time the Mercy's Hope docked and began transferring patients, nearly everyone on board was infected. And then the alien medics started showing symptoms, supposed to spread through casual contact. But something about this particular strain was different, more aggressive, more contagious. Within hours, all 8 alien medics were too sick to work, leaving Nathan and his 12 human colleagues to care for over 200 critically ill patients. Laura found Nathan in the corridor between emergency treatment bays, his face pale with exhaustion, but his eyes still sharp and focused. The Council is sending reinforcements, she told him, but they are at least 9 days away. 9 days. Nathan did the math in his head and felt his stomach drop. Most of their patients would be dead in 72 hours without constant care, and there was no way 12 people could provide that level of attention to 200 patients for 9 days straight. Then we work until they get here, he said simply, and Laura nodded as if this was the most obvious thing in the world. The next 9 days blurred together into an endless cycle of treatment and monitoring and emergency interventions. Nathan performed 17 surgeries in the first 3 days alone, his hands steady despite the exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm him with every passing hour. Laura moved between patients like a ghost, appearing wherever she was needed most, her calm voice and gentle hands bringing comfort to people who were terrified and suffering. The human medics took turns sleeping in shifts of no more than 2 hours at a time, their bodies somehow continuing to function long past the point where any other species would have collapsed. Human circadian rhythms, it turned out, were remarkably flexible when lives were at stake. Their bodies produced adrenaline and cortisol and a dozen other chemicals that kept them alert and functioning, drawing on reserves of energy that should have been impossible. On the 4th day, Nathan found himself resuscitating a Valorian child who had stopped breathing, his hands pumping the tiny chest while Laura prepared emergency medications. The child had been clinically dead for nearly 4 minutes before they managed to restart her heart. And Nathan held her small hand and whispered reassurances until she was stable enough to be moved back to the treatment bay. He did not count how many patients he resuscitated over those 9 days. He did not want to know. Laura later told him the number was 17. 17 people who had been dead and were now alive because of him. But he just shrugged and said he had been doing his job. On the 6th day, the coffee ran out. Laura mentioned this to Nathan in passing, noting with mild frustration that she would have to switch to tea until the supply ship arrived. She did not mention that she had been awake for nearly 40 hours at that point, or that her hands had started trembling from exhaustion, or that she had personally saved the lives of at least 30 patients through her quick thinking and medical skill. Nathan did not mention any of those things either. They just kept working. The council reinforcements arrived on the 10th day to find a medical bay full of recovering patients and a human medical team that looked like they had been through a war. Of the 212 patients who had been infected with Kellyan fever, 198 had survived. The mortality rate for untreated Kellyan fever was 90%. The human medics had achieved a survival rate of over 93%, with a skeleton crew working around the clock for 9 days straight. The council medical officers who took over care of the patients were stunned, unable to comprehend how such a small team had accomplished what should have been impossible. They asked Nathan how he had done it, how 12 humans had saved nearly 200 lives without any support or relief. Nathan seemed genuinely puzzled by the question. "We just did what any medical team would do," he said. "We triaged the worst cases and worked systematically through the patient list. It was basic medicine, really." Laura nodded in agreement beside him. "The worst part was the coffee running out on day 6, she added. "I am not a fan of tea." The Valorian survivors called them angels, a term that Nathan found deeply uncomfortable. He was not an angel. He was just a doctor who had done his job under difficult circumstances. The fact that no other species in the galaxy could have done what he and his team had done never occurred to him. The council medical officers wrote detailed reports about what had happened aboard the Mercy's Hope, documenting the impossible endurance and skill of the human medical team. They noted that the humans had worked for an average of 20 hours per day for 9 consecutive days, with only brief breaks for sleep and food. They noted that the humans had performed complex medical procedures while running on almost no rest, without making a single critical error. They noted that when asked about their accomplishments, the humans had seemed confused by the attention, and insisted they had simply done what anyone would have done. Ambassador Zylketh added these reports to his file with a growing sense of something like awe. "They saved 200 lives," he wrote. 12 humans working alone for 9 days against a disease that should have killed nearly everyone. And they think this is normal. They think anyone could have done what they did. They have no idea that they are extraordinary, and I am beginning to believe they never will." He paused and considered what he had learned about humans over the years since first contact. "They are not humble by choice," he finally wrote. "They are humble by ignorance. They genuinely do not know what they are capable, and somehow that makes their accomplishments even more remarkable." 10 years had passed since humanity's first contact with the Galactic Council. 10 years of integration and cooperation, and countless moments that had left the alien species of the galaxy wondering what exactly they had invited into their midst. Ambassador Zylketh stood before the assembled council representatives, his presentation materials ready, and his 4 hearts beating faster than they had in years. He had spent a decade studying humans, documenting their behavior and their capabilities and their strange, persistent belief that they were nothing special. Today he would finally share his conclusions with the galaxy. The council chamber was filled with representatives from over 200 species, diplomats and scientists and military leaders who had all heard stories about the humans, but had never truly understood what those stories meant. Zilketh began his presentation with the basics, explaining that humans had evolved on a world classified as a Category 7 death world, a planet so hostile that most species would have gone extinct within a single generation. He showed images of Earth's environments, the scorching deserts and frozen tundras and violent storms that humans considered perfectly normal places to live. He explained that human bodies had evolved to survive conditions that would kill most other species within minutes, that they could regulate their internal temperature and function in extreme heat or cold, that they could go without sleep for days and without food for weeks, and without water for several days. He showed footage of Jake Lawson casually cracking a reinforced crystalline pillar just by leaning on it, then shrugging and walking away as if nothing had happened. He showed medical records from Kepler station, documenting how Danny Cole had lifted a 300-kilogram beam and held it for 4 minutes, then insisted it was no big deal. New Haven, where 800 human colonists had repelled an invasion force of 10,000 Kreth warriors, followed by an interview with Chris Bradley, in which he attributed the victory to luck and the hard work of the civilians. He showed the survival statistics from the plague ship incident, where 12 human medics had saved nearly 200 lives over 9 days of continuous work, and then complained that the worst part was running out of coffee. The council chamber was silent as Zilketh presented each piece of evidence, the alien representatives watching with growing unease as the true scope of human capabilities became clear. "The most terrifying part about humans," Zilketh said finally, his voice steady, despite the weight of what he was about to say, "is not their strength." He paused and looked around the chamber at the hundreds of faces watching him. "It is not their endurance, it is not their adaptability, it is not their resilience, or their capacity for violence when provoked." Another pause, longer this time. "The most terrifying part about humans is that they genuinely do not know how powerful they are." He brought up a final image, a photograph of Katie Morgan, shaking hands with a Threllian diplomat at a recent trade conference, both of them smiling as if they were old friends. "They think they are ordinary," Zilketh continued. "They think their homeworld is normal. They think everyone can lift heavy objects and survive extreme temperatures and fight for days without rest." He let that statement hang in the air for a moment. They have no frame of reference for their own capabilities, because they have only ever known themselves. They have only ever lived among other humans. They have never had anyone to compare themselves to. The Valorian mining survivors from Kepler station were in the audience, including Kethvar, who still bore the scars from being trapped beneath that support beam. The passengers from the Wandering Star were there as well, many of them accompanied by the human medics who had saved their lives. The colonists of New Haven had sent representatives, including Chris Bradley himself, who sat in the back row looking uncomfortable with all the attention. "And so they walk among us," Zilketh said, "these apex predators from a death world, smiling and apologizing and asking if they are being too loud." He thought of all the humans he had met over the past decade, all the casual displays of impossible strength and endurance that they had dismissed as nothing special. They offer to help carry things. They volunteer for dangerous missions, because they genuinely do not understand why anyone would hesitate. They rush toward disasters that would make any sane species run the other way. He paused again, and let his voice soften. "And they are kind," he said. "They are generous, they are humble, they genuinely want to help." Help! The chamber remained silent as he delivered his final conclusion. They have absolutely no idea how terrifying that humility truly is. Zilketh stepped back from the podium and waited as the council processed what he had told them. The vote came 2 hours later, after extensive discussion and debate among the representatives. The motion to extend full partnership status to humanity passed unanimously. It was proposed by Kethvar and the other Valorian miners, seconded by the survivors from the Wandering Star, and supported by the colonists of New Haven. The Kreth Dominion, humiliated by their defeat at New Haven, did not send a representative to the vote. Katie Morgan accepted the partnership on behalf of Earth, standing at the same podium where Zilketh had delivered his presentation. She gave a short speech, thanking the Council for the opportunity, and promising that humanity would do its best to be worthy of the honor. "No, we are new to all of this," she said with a self-deprecating smile, "and we are still learning how to fit in with the rest of the galaxy." She paused and looked out at the assembled representatives. "But we will work hard, and we will try our best, and we promise not to mess things up too badly." The audience laughed at that, a warm sound that filled the chamber with something like hope. Zilketh watched from his seat, and marveled at how completely Katie had missed the point. She genuinely believed that humanity needed to work hard to prove themselves, that they had something to prove, that their acceptance was conditional on good behavior. She had no idea that every species in the galaxy was terrified of her and her people. No idea that the unanimous vote had been driven as much by fear as by gratitude. She had no idea that she was making a promise that humanity could not possibly keep. Not because they would fail, but because they would exceed every expectation placed upon them. They would do more than anyone asked, give more than anyone expected, sacrifice more than anyone thought possible. And they would do it all while insisting that they were just doing what anyone would do. That was simply who they were. Zilketh added one final note to his file on humanity as the celebration continued around him. "They are exactly what this galaxy needs," he wrote. "Protectors who do not know they are protectors, heroes who do not believe they are heroes, friends who will move mountains for those they care about, without ever understanding how remarkable that truly is." He watched Katie laugh at something Jake Lawson said, watched Danny Cole shake hands with Kepler, watched Chris Bradley try unsuccessfully to avoid the grateful colonists who wanted to thank him for saving their lives. And he smiled, a rare expression for a Valorian. "We are in good hands," he wrote. "They just have no idea how good those hands truly are. And perhaps that is exactly as it should be."